Yes, brilliant. So as I say, welcome to what you need to know about the end of furlough and the new job support scheme. So if I can hand over to our speakers, and I will just share the slides at the same time.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
Lovely to be with you today. My name's Alico, my colleague is Michael, and thank you very much to Mac for inviting us to be with you today. Just thought I would start with a few words about Wrigley's Solicitors. We're a law firm with 3 offices in the north of England. Michael and I are employment lawyers in the charity and social economy team. So our day-to-day work is advising charities, third sector organisations, and education sector clients on all aspects of employment law. You can find our contact details at the end of the slides, so please do give us a call or an email if there's anything that you want to talk to us about specifically. Just moving to the next slide, you can see there a link to our events page, and that's where you can go if you want to book onto Wrigley's free webinars for charities. As well as live webinars, you can access our recorded webinars on there. There is at the moment a charity governance series of webinars on, which you might find useful. Last week, for example, there was one on serious incident reporting to the Charity Commission. This week on Thursday, there's one on data protection for charities. So as I say, they are free to charities and third sector organisations, so please do have a look at those. Moving to the next slide, this is an overview of what Michael and I are going to talk about today. So I'm going to start by looking at the end of furlough and what that means for employers. I'm also going to talk about the basics if you're going to be trying to agree changes to employment contracts when people come back to work. And then Michael is going to take you through the details of the new job support scheme and talk about how to move staff onto that scheme if that's what you decide to do. And then we're also at the end going to have a look at what happens if you have a redundancy situation and how that interacts with the new scheme. And as Helen said, there's going to be some time for questions at the end, so please feel free to ask them. We won't be able to give you specific legal advice, but we will be able to answer general questions that you have. So on to the next slide. The first thing to say is that it's really important to look at the bigger picture if you can. I'm sure that, like a lot of organisations, you've basically been firefighting over the last few months. And when new government support or guidance comes out, it's tempting to just respond in a reactive way to that. But you need to try and take a step back and consider your organisation's business needs and the needs of your service users or customers. You need to start by looking again at your charitable objects and purposes, because it's really possible that you've drifted away from your key objectives in recent months. And it may be that you need to take stock and bring your mission back to what it should be, or you need to think about changing your charitable objects to bring them up to date with what you are actually doing. You obviously need to look at your financial position and projections, and part of that is going to be talking to key stakeholders about their plans for coming months, and that will help you to get the bigger picture, and that's really looking at where your key opportunities and threats are going to be coming from in the upcoming months. Think as well about surveying your staff and making sure you understand how they're thinking at the moment, particularly if you're planning on changing the way that they're working, maybe having more of a remote offering, which is going to impact on them, and perhaps even more working from home. So looking at the next slide, at the moment, I'm sure you will be thinking about how your organisation's staffing needs are working out. And it may well be that you have some staff who are still on furlough, whether that's full-time furlough or flexible furlough. And the questions you'll be asking yourselves are whether you have work for those staff, for all of them or some of them, or whether perhaps you have a redundancy situation. You'll be asking yourselves about whether you should be asking staff to come into the workplace or whether you can accommodate working from home. Of course, the advice at the moment from government is that if people can work from home, they should work from home. And that's particularly the case for people who are extremely clinically vulnerable to the virus. So that's people who were shielding earlier this year. But you may also be thinking about asking staff to accept changes to their roles or their terms and conditions. Perhaps you need to ask them to have fewer hours and lower pay. You might have layoff or short-time working clauses in your contracts, and that might be something that you're thinking about. Remember, if you do lay people off or have short-time working, then in some cases they will be eligible for what's called guarantee payments. So it's a minimum amount of money. It's not very much, but you need to make sure you're aware of how much it is. Michael's going to take you through the job support scheme, but obviously you need to be thinking about whether that's feasible for you. Is it going to help you to retain staff at the moment? On the next slide, we're going to take a look at some of the mechanics of bringing people back to work from furlough. The job retention scheme, or the furlough scheme, is coming to an end on the 31st of October. And so at the moment, I'm sure you are, or you need to be, contacting furloughed staff to explain to them the arrangements for ending furlough. And you also need to be explaining the arrangements from November onwards. Remember that the default position is that when staff come back, they should go back onto their normal terms and conditions, so their full hours and pay from before the furlough period. And remember that you can't make changes to employment contracts without them being agreed by the employee or by a trade union where that's relevant. ACAS has a very useful template letter for bringing people back from furlough, and the link to those template letters is at the end of the slide. So they can be very helpful just to set out the detail you need to be telling staff. It's important to give reasonable notice. Now we have just a bit more than a week to go before the end of the scheme, so you really need to be giving notice this week, I would say, if you haven't already given notice. Remember that people, while they've been on furlough, may have taken on caring responsibilities or other responsibilities outside work, and they need some notice for alternative arrangements to be made. When you send a letter to staff, you should really set out any different working practices that you're expecting people to have when they come back. And you need to make some key information clear. Obviously, the return date, the pay and hours that people will go back onto, and also how holiday is dealt with, and particularly how much holiday they have remaining to take before the end of the holiday year. On the next slide, it's a good opportunity when you're writing to staff about the end of furlough to explain to them any health and safety measures that you've put in place in the workplace. That will help to reassure people about coming back to work. You should, of course, share your risk assessment with staff and help them to understand the controls that are put in place. And you may well need to put some in, almost like induction training in, to get people used to any workplace measures that they won't have been used to up to now. You also need to give staff the opportunity to tell you about any concerns they have about health and safety controls or the way that they're being implemented, and do respond to those concerns. If you have people with particular medical conditions or who are in a high risk group, I really recommend that you speak to them individually about how they feel about coming back to work. There is a link at the end of these slides to the Health and Safety Executive website, which has got some really useful guidance for dealing with vulnerable and high risk staff if they have to come back to work and can't work from home. Just to reiterate, if people can work from home, they should. But if they can't, you're going to have to put in place measures to control the risk. As with any employee who might have a disability, that might involve you looking at trying to find out more information about their condition from their GP or a consultant, or it might involve referring them to occupational health if you don't have much information about their medical condition already. So that will help you to work out if there are reasonable adjustments you need to make for them, and also inform you about any decisions you make, for example, about whether they have to return to work or not. And think about phased return as well. Like anybody who's been off for a long time, in some cases a phased return might be a good way of making people feel more comfortable about coming back. So moving on to the next slide, it's always best practice to maintain regular communication with staff, to talk to them about any proposals that you have, and to ask for feedback before you finalise policies and decisions. A number of you may be working in sectors where you have trade unions who are recognised, and if so, you must involve them in your proposals as well as your staff. And actually, if you have a procedural and collective agreement in place, then you need to be often involving trade unions as a matter of course under that agreement. If you are communicating with people, try not to leave anybody out. Obviously, people who've been off on furlough, or people who've been at work, people who've been off on other kinds of leave like maternity leave or sick leave, make sure you involve everybody in your consultation. And do remember that it might be that your employees at the moment feel a bit like they're in two separate groups, people who've been on furlough and people who haven't, who might have been working very, very hard. So do what you can to try and reintegrate them, bring them back together and make them feel like they are part of the same organisation. On the next slide, we're just going to look at what you need to do if you want to change terms and conditions or try to do so. It's possible that your finances or your operational position at the moment means that you don't have enough work for everybody, and you're going to propose a reduction in hours and pay. Maybe you actually want to change people's job roles because of the way that work has changed for you over the last few months. Or you might want to have a different location for work if you've started to work in different parts of the community. The starting point when you're trying to change terms and conditions is having a really clear business case for the changes that you need to make. And you need to set those out in writing and share them with employees and their representatives. Remember, you can't make fundamental changes to an employment contract without agreement. And so you do need to consult people, and if they do agree, make sure that that agreement is evidenced in writing. That might be by asking them to sign a copy of the letter setting out the changes, or to sign a new contract altogether. So yes, if you've got a collective agreement with a trade union, then you need to make sure you reach agreement with them to make the changes. And remember that that will bind any employee whose contract incorporates the collective agreement. So not just those members of the trade union. If you did make a change to people's employment contracts without agreeing it, that would effectively be a dismissal. So you are opening up the organisation to claims of unfair dismissal or other claims like discrimination in some cases. If you can't get agreement from staff, then one thing, which is a last resort, is to consider dismissing them and offering them new terms and conditions. But it's a very, very risky way to proceed, and you should always get legal advice before taking that route. I'm now going to hand over to Michael, and he's going to take you through details of the new job support scheme.
Hi everyone, thanks Alico for that. Yes, so as Alico has mentioned, I'm going to talk about the job support scheme, and we'll be touching on the job retention bonus as well as part of my presentation. If we just pop on to the next slide, we'll just start with the overview of the JSS. Before we go any further, the first thing that I really need to say is that unfortunately, Alico and I won't be able to give you all of the answers to all of your questions on the JSS. And the simple reason for that is at the moment, we don't yet have full guidance precisely on all of the details of the way certain elements of the scheme are going to work. But certainly Alico and I can draw on our experience of advising people on the coronavirus job retention scheme to spot problems and make educated guesses about what certain details mean, but ultimately the full guidance will need to be consulted. So at this stage, that full guidance hasn't been published, but you will need to keep your eyes and ears open for that. I would suggest one of the probably useful ways to see that coming is to be plugged into certain social media platforms. By all means, if you want to follow our Twitter feed, that will no doubt flag up when the guidance comes through, so that might be useful for you. But the aim of this presentation is therefore to help you conceptualize the scheme and to draw attention to its key aspects. But it's important to say that even with the limited information that we have available, there is not really enough time to cover every single aspect in detail. However, our hope is that when you have the chance to review these slides and this presentation in the context of all the available materials, so as we note on the slide there are fact sheets and certain government publications, all of which we've provided links to at the end of this slide pack. You will be on a good footing to use the JSS with some confidence. Just moving on to the next slide. So this next slide is a visual aid that I hope will be very useful, particularly when you come back to review the information today. And the purpose is really to show that there are 5 broad steps involved in successfully using the scheme. And it's also a reminder that the employer is central to the operation of the scheme. As with the coronavirus job retention scheme, if you have experience of that, there is no direct relationship between your employees and the government. You need to deal with each separately. But what that does on the left-hand side is really show the first element of the scheme, which is you changing your contractual arrangements with the individuals so they can go onto the JSS. And on the right-hand side, it's you as the employer dealing with the government, obviously making a request for funds. But just moving on to the next slide, before we go through the processes, we're going to have a look at the eligibility criteria. And this essentially boils down to 2 key entities. The first is the employer, and the second is the individual that the employer is claiming the grant for. Now, just a word quickly on terminology here. I'm going to try and use the term individual, but I might slip from habit into employee and worker. As you'll discover under the scheme, when we're talking about individuals that you can claim the grant for, that is anyone who's on your payroll system. Obviously, in law, there is a distinct difference between employees and workers. But if I use that term throughout the presentation, I'm talking generally about individuals who are on your payroll. So that could be employees, workers. It could also be an office holder, but will obviously not tend to include independent contractors if you have those working for your organisation. But coming on to employers, those who qualify are going to be an employer with a UK bank account who are using the PAYE system. And an employer does not need to have previously used the furlough scheme to access the JSS. It's available to small and medium enterprises without any form of assessment, but large businesses and organisations will be subject to financial assessment by HMRC, where in essence, you're going to be asked to show that your turnover and your financial performance has been negatively affected by the pandemic. Now, we don't have a precise definition of what an SME is for the purposes of the scheme, but we assume that that will be companies or organisations that have a turnover of no more than £36 million, a balance sheet of not more than £18 million, and that have no more than 250 staff on the books. And we take that definition from the Companies Act 2006. So there's a decent chance that all of you watching today will fall within that definition, and you won't have to go through a specific assessment. Just moving on to the next slide to look at individual workers that qualify. To be eligible, someone, so this is an individual, as I say, employee, worker, or all the terms combined, that must be someone who is in work and has been on the employer's PAYE payroll on or before the 23rd of September of this year. And there must be real-time information, or RTI information, submissions about this individual from the employer to HMRC on or before that date. So unfortunately, if you have taken on staff since the 23rd of September, they're not going to be eligible for the scheme. Likewise, if you did take someone on, but that information, the RTI information, hasn't been processed and provided to HMRC on or before the 23rd of September, you won't be able to claim grant money in respect to those individuals either. The other key aspect for the individual is that they must work at least 33% of what's called their usual hours in the first 3 months of the scheme's operation. The reason why we say in the first 3 months is the scheme is subject to a review, which is due to take place at the time in January. And what we might see is that the government tweaks that 33% minimum work requirement. Certainly, as we saw with the coronavirus job retention scheme, they changed and ratcheted up the mechanics. And so it's possible that we'll see that minimum obligation increase in the new year. So it is subject to review, and you need to be mindful not to get caught out by that if it does change. It doesn't matter if the individual was furloughed in the past or not, they're still eligible for the JSS. And individuals can cycle on and off of the JSS and do not have to have the same work pattern each month, but each working arrangement must cover a period of 7 days. So when you're looking at the basic units of the scheme, your 7-day period is the basic unit of a period of time that you can claim grant money in respect of. It's also worth pointing out that individuals cannot be made redundant or put on notice of redundancy during any period in which you as the employer are claiming the grant for that individual. So that doesn't actually stop you consulting about redundancies with individuals whilst they're on the scheme, but certainly you cannot actually make them redundant or give them notice of redundancy for any period of 7 days that you want to claim grant money for under the scheme. Moving on to the next slide. In terms of how does it all work, so the basic premise is there are two elements to this. The first is that an individual obviously has to be in work. As the scheme says, they have to work a minimum of 33% of their usual hours. The employer will be responsible for paying that employee or worker for that time regardless. What then happens is with the other chunk of time that isn't worked, that is divided essentially into three. The government will pay 1/3 of that. The employer will pay the second third, and final third will be left unpaid. And the government's third is capped at £697.92 a month. Now, the interesting thing about the way the scheme works is it actually, in some ways, incentivises employers to keep someone on a minimum requirement of work that is above 33%. Actually, the higher you go in ratio terms, the better it is for the employer. Obviously, the infographic that we showed at the top, which is one that you might have all seen, where the government says if you work 33% of your time as an individual, the employer will pay 55% of your usual wages. The government will pay the extra 22%, which is the additional third. And in total, that employee or worker will walk away with 77% of their usual pay. Obviously, that's great for the individual being paid. Doesn't look like such a great deal for the employer, particularly when you note that the government's contribution will not cover any associated Class 1 national insurance contributions or pensions contributions as well. So not only is the employer paying 55%, they're paying national insurance and pensions on the whole 77 that's paid to the individual. Now, if we take another example, so say a worker or individual who's working 70% of their usual hours, what the scheme will do is say the 30% that's left, that'll be chopped into three. The government will pay 1/3 of that. You as the employer will pay the second, the other third will go away. Now, in that situation, the individual will be paid 90% of their usual hours for working 70% of the time, which is obviously still great for them. But it means the employer will be paying 80% of the usual wages for someone who's worked 70% of the time, which in ratio terms is obviously a lot better than paying 55 for someone who only works 33. So this way, the scheme actually incentivizes employers to really, if you can't take someone back in their full hours, to get as close to that as you possibly can. Now, it's important to point out the terminology of usual hours and usual hourly wages hasn't yet been formally provided to us through guidance, but we're expecting that this will be based on a similar methodology as was used for the coronavirus job retention scheme. Now, if you've had experience of the job retention scheme for coronavirus, then you're probably quite familiar with what this means. But if you haven't, I really strongly recommend that you have a look at the guidance of how this is calculated under the job retention scheme, because it's likely to follow this course for the JSS as well. And we've provided a link to that guidance in the slide pack so that you can have a look. If you haven't already looked at it, that is probably something that will be a good idea to work through with your payroll provider, because they should really be able to pull together all of the key information you need to make the necessary calculations. Obviously, it's going to be more difficult if you have staff who have variable hours to work out what their usual hours and usual pay are than if you have regular salaried staff who work, standard full working weeks, for example. So please do look at that. Yes, sorry, I've just got a point on my slide there that was obviously Class 1 NICs and pension contributions aren't covered at any point for the government's contribution. So the employer will be paying all of that. So you really do have to factor that into your costs as well. Just moving on to the next slide, which is looking at the practicalities of moving someone on to the JSS. HMRC will check claims and payments will be withheld, or you may be asked to repay them if a claim is found to be fraudulent or based on incorrect information. Now, one of the key parts of this is that employers must agree the new short-time working arrangements with their staff. They must make any changes to the employment contract by agreement with that individual, and you must notify that individual in writing. And this is one of the key points. Any agreement must be made available to HMRC on request. So if you're submitting your claim for grant funding from the government, they might ask for the documentation to show that you have gone through the proper process with the individual before they will release the money. So it's really important to get those contractual changes in writing and agreed. So again, if you have experience of the coronavirus job scheme, then it works on a very similar basis like that. You're setting out what hours the individual is going to be expected to work whilst you're using the scheme, what that means in terms of their pay, and obviously leaving yourself contractual options to change those in the future should you need to. Moving on to the next slide, which is really just how do you make a claim. So the scheme will operate from the 1st of November and is presently scheduled to close at the end of April 2021, with obviously that review that we've mentioned taking place in January. Employers will be able to make a claim via an online portal through the .gov.uk website from December 2020, and you will be receiving payments after you've submitted your grant request on a monthly basis in arrears. So this is quite important, because what it does mean is that all of the costs, if you are going to go on the JSS, you as the employer will have to stump up that in advance and seek to recover funding from the JSS in arrears. And as we say, you make claims on a monthly basis and it's paid in arrears on that calculation. From experience with the coronavirus job retention scheme, payments through the portal did seem to go quite smoothly. Most payments were received by employers within 6 working days. So a relatively quick turnaround. But again, particularly if you are an organisation that's really in the margins and struggling at the moment, you really need to factor in that time as well to make sure that you have the time to get the funding in and still balance the books. Just moving on to the next slide. We're going to look at the JSS, what the government's called the extension scheme. So this sits alongside the JSS in very particular circumstances, and it's only for employers whose businesses have had to close as a result of restrictions being enforced. And what we're talking about there is the tier system that's obviously been widely publicised since early October. Obviously for many of you in Manchester, you're currently waiting to see what's going to happen with the implication of tiers being imposed on the Greater Manchester area. So for example, if you are, as we all know, under tier 3, if you're a pub or bar that's being forced to close, under that scenario, then the JSS extension will be of use to those kinds of organisations. It's important to note, however, that this being forced to close does not include specific localised closures mandated by a local public health authority. So what we're talking about there is if you are an individual organisation, say a gym or a bar or a charity, who has had perhaps a very bad outbreak of coronavirus and you've been asked to close by a local authority, but it's just your building or your organisation, that won't cover you. You won't be under the JSS extension scheme. So it has to be mandated by the tier lockdown. If this does happen, however, if you are shut down as a result of the tier system, employers can apply for grant funding for 2/3 of the total of an individual's salary up to a cap of £2,100 per month. So just calculating that out, that's someone who's on a full annual gross salary of £37,800. Employers do not need to contribute to that 2/3 payment, but they will still need to pay the national insurance contributions and pensions contributions on any salary that is paid. So you don't have all of your costs covered, but obviously the vast majority of it is. As with the JSS, claims will be paid in arrears through the online portal. So again, you are still going to be stumping up the cost of this upfront and then reclaiming it afterwards. And it's also important to note that with the JSS extension, this will only cover individuals where the business premises or organisation they work at has been closed and they still cannot work. So in other words, it won't cover those who, if their premises have been closed, can still work from home. Now, the particular restrictions under the tier system have not been entirely clarified. It's still not entirely clear what precise types of organisation or business will be shut under a tier 3. It seems that individual local authorities, when the lockdown is imposed, will notify the classes of organisation that the restriction applies to, but the guidance that is available on tier 3 and the other tiers, we have provided a link to that in the slide pack. So again, we suggest that would be worth you having a look at, just to see if you think you'd fall within those categories that are there. Just moving on to the next slide. So we're going to take off our job support scheme hats. We're now moving into job retention scheme territory because we're talking about the job retention bonus. Just as a quick overview, this scheme is for organisations who've had individuals who have been furloughed at some point and who are still employed by their employer on the 31st of January next year. It's important to note that the payment, the bonus, the £1,000, is paid to the employer, not the individual, and there is no obligation on the employer to pass the payment on to individuals. Obviously, it's designed as an incentive to employers to have kept people employed rather than to have made them redundant or to have dismissed them. The bonus is subject to the individuals who've been kept employed having received a minimum amount of pay between November and February. You will have to wait until the 15th of February to make a claim for the bonus. But it's important to note that the window closes on the 31st of March. So you have a relatively limited period of time to make sure that you get your claim in. So if you are looking to do this, please don't get caught out by that. Just moving on to the next slide. I'm going to have a look at some of the qualifications. So again, looking at the employers and the individuals concerned, if you are an employer who have furloughed individuals and you've made an eligible claim to the coronavirus job retention scheme in respect of them, you will be entitled to claim the bonus in respect of those individuals. Now, it's important to note that if for any reason you've repaid any of that funding under the job retention scheme, you won't be able to claim the bonus in respect of the individuals to whom that repayment relates. So I'm sure no one here has been asked to repay it because you've fraudulently claimed any money, but some organisations have repaid funding because at the end of the maybe an initial claim period, they realised that actually they didn't need it and for moral reasons perhaps repaid to HMRC. Now, if you have done that, that also means that you won't be entitled to the bonus as well. It is important to note that employers can still make a claim for a bonus payment if you have subsequently claimed for an individual on the JSS. So it doesn't matter if someone then goes onto the JSS, you can still claim a bonus payment about that individual. Talking about the individuals, as we've noted, this has to be an individual that the employer has made an eligible claim in respect of under the coronavirus job retention scheme. This individual must have been kept continuously employed from the end of their furlough period up to the 31st of January. They must not have been served with contractual or statutory notice, i.e. that they're being dismissed from their job as at the 31st of January, and that includes any notice of retirement. And they are subject to de minimis payments as well. So that individual must have received £1,560 gross across those months that we've listed in the slide there. So I think that works out at about £520 a month. So they have to have at least received that in pay from you. Just moving on to the next slide, which is how to claim under the job retention bonus scheme. As we've noted, you can't make a claim until the 15th of February, but claims will again be made via the online portal through .gov.uk website. We are still waiting further guidance on the precise way in which you'll be able to make claims, but that guidance is expected in January. So again, please keep your eyes open for that for when it comes out. It's important to note that before claiming, employers must have reported all of their payments to individuals that you want to claim the bonus in respect of between November and February to HMRC through the full payment submissions via the real-time information on your payroll. Again, that's all very technical payroll information. I would suggest, if you haven't already, to have a conversation with your payroll provider and go through that, because it's possible that you might have already perhaps not kept up with all of the requirements that are needed. In that respect, we haven't, I'm afraid it's an omission on my part, we haven't included the fact sheet about the job retention bonus scheme on the slide pack, but if you Google it, it's quite easy to find. I would suggest that you, and particularly with payroll people in mind, you go through the fact sheet and just make sure that you're ticking off all of the requirements that are on there. As I say, a lot of it is to do with making sure you're complying with your obligations under PAYE, and that you're making the right real-time information submissions in respect of all these individuals, because it looks as though HMRC is going to take a very key look at the information that you've provided about them before they allow any bonus payments to be made. So just to make sure you've got all your ducks in a row before the 15th of February, I would suggest that you look at that guidance in some depth. That brings me to the end of my section. I'm now going to hand back over to Alico, and then I'll be back for the Q&A session. So I shall see you all there. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So moving to the next slide, just a quick word about what happens if you're dealing with a redundancy situation. The starting point, if you do have a redundancy situation at the moment, is to prepare a really good business case to be able to share with your employees the reason why you think that redundancies are required. And remember that you must always consult on proposed redundancies before any final decisions are made. There are some really rigorous requirements if you're making 20 or more people redundant within a 90-day period, which I won't go into detail on here. But in that case, you have to consult with representatives of employees rather than directly. And there's some very stringent requirements in terms of reporting to government, for example, on that redundancy situation. But you do always have a duty to consult with individuals as well when you have a redundancy situation. If you'd like more detail on this, Michael delivered a webinar in May, which you can find in recorded form on our website on the events page. And also my colleague Sue and I did a webinar in July, on the 22nd of July, on restructure and changing terms, which might help you if you're going through that process. Just very briefly, a fair redundancy process means meaningful consultation. So talking to people about what you plan to do before you've made any final decisions. You must seek alternatives to redundancy and offer any alternative roles which exist, and also always offer a right of appeal if you dismiss somebody as redundant. On the next slide, just a reminder that at the moment, alternatives to redundancy include the new government scheme, the job support scheme. So you need to consider whether it's feasible to use that scheme to avoid or mitigate the effects of redundancy. You should also think about any eligibility for the job retention bonus, which might help your financial situation. And if you have short time or layoff clauses in your employment contracts, think about using those before you take the step to make redundancies. But if none of those options are feasible, you need to be able to explain exactly why as part of your consultation process. Okay, so just moving on to the next slide, we've got our links here just set out for you. So these are the links to the things that Michael and I have been talking about as we've gone through. I hope you'll find those useful. And now we've got some time for questions. So I'm going to hand back to Danielle. Or is it Helen? Sorry, Helen.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Alico and Michael. That was so useful. A lot of detail, which I'm sure people are still absorbing and thinking about any questions that they have. But a really, really useful summary of the new scheme and the options available to employers. We do have one question that was submitted ahead of time, if that's okay. It may well be from Michael because it relates to the job support scheme specifically. So the question is, can employers top up the salary for employees who are doing only part of their hours on top of the government paying a third and the employer paying a third, or does the employee have to lose a third?
Thanks for that, Helen. Yes, that's a really good question. I can see there's actually been another question in the Q&A which relates to this as well. And as that individual, Caroline, has pointed out, there is a specific paragraph in the JSS fact sheet which talks about there is an expectation that employers who are using the scheme will not be topping up individuals. This is quite a tricky one because we've seen similar language before in relation to coronavirus job retention scheme. Obviously, under that scheme, employers could top up their wages, and it would seem counterintuitive that the JSS would suddenly decide that employers legally are barred from doing it. This very much seems as an expectation to just be what the government would prefer to happen, rather than actually being a legal prohibition on someone topping up. But I'm afraid the honest answer, and really the answer I can really only give you, is we don't know yet, and we haven't had specific clarity on this point. As I say, you can make an argument either side. You can say to some extent it makes sense for employers to be able to top up, and it would be more in line with what's happened under the job retention scheme. On the other hand, it might be the government saying, well, hang on, we are now at the point where if we are going to be supporting you in a limited way, you know, if you can actually afford to do all this in the first place, why are we therefore providing you with additional funding? But it's a really good question, and I think it's one of those that really highlights the grey areas that unfortunately the government still produce when they give out these fact sheets. We certainly know that they had some trouble clarifying all the details on the job retention scheme. It seems as though we're still in that position with the JSS as well. Alico, I didn't know if you had anything else that you wanted to add on that point.
No, I think we don't know is the honest answer, but you need to look out for it if you're planning to. You need to get some clarity on that. And we're hoping for guidance, obviously, within the next week, because if it's later than that, we're really in trouble.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out.
November.
Yeah, sorry, Alico. It is worth pointing out that the government has quite a habit of dropping these guidances on the Friday before the scheme comes into operation. Yeah. So there's a decent chance we'll be getting it sometime Friday afternoon. But as Alico points out, that detailed guidance really isn't needed. As we've mentioned, there's issues such as how do you calculate usual hours? How do you calculate someone's usual hourly wage? That is really going to make the difference for some organisations working out whether the scheme is viable for them or not. And unfortunately, all we can do in the meantime is say, under the job retention scheme, this is how it worked. Perhaps plan on that basis, but keep your eyes peeled for further guidance.
Thank you very much, Michael. I hope to some extent, Caroline, that answers your question with what we know at the moment. Michael, is there a sort of specific site or somewhere where people can go to find out if, you know, when the guidance kind of comes out, where does it tend to go to?
Well, the guidance is always published on the .gov.uk website when it comes out. So you can set up alerts on the website that will ping an email to you if you're looking for that. So if you can put in certain search terms. To be honest, I would say that usually the way that certainly myself and I would imagine Alico and many people in our position find out is through following certain Twitter accounts. That is often how the information these days is disseminated quite quickly. So as I suggested, you know, we follow certain barristers or the law sources like the ELA or ACAS. Organisations like that are likely to be putting the breaking news out, which we will then obviously try and follow on as well. So if you want to follow us, you can try ACAS. You can try organisations like Citizens Advice Bureau, that they are probably going to be plugged into the same systems that we are.
Great, thank you very much. So I shall hand over to Danielle for, we have some more questions, I think.
We do, and I'm just furiously typing away to get some of the answers written down for a resource for everybody as well. But so I had a question from Anna who wanted to know whether or not has holiday been accruing during furlough leave, and how should we deal with the backlog of holiday when staff come back?
Yep, I'll take that one. Holiday has been accruing, so if you haven't asked people to take holiday during their furlough leave, they will have a backlog waiting for them when they come back to work. And that might make things quite tricky if everybody's trying to squeeze in their holidays before the end of the year. So one thing you can do is to ask people to take it as a chunk, maybe before they return to work, but you do have to give twice as much notice as the length of the holiday. So say somebody had 5 days to take, you'd have to give them 10 days notice to take that. But you could regulate that holiday and require them to take it at certain times. You can also you could try to change your holiday policy, which might need to be with consultation with unions, in order to be able to carry over holiday into the next holiday year. And the law's been changed to allow the 4 weeks statutory basic holiday to be able to be carried over into the next 2 holiday years. So there is a bit of flexibility there.
Brilliant. Does that answer your question, Anna? Okay. Anna's around. Oh, she's not on video, so we can't see her nodding, but I'm presuming yes, she's had a thank you in the chat box there. Thank you very much. I will move on to the next question. So we had a question from Felicia, who was from the Apprentice Trust but could not join the meeting today. And she was asking about, she currently runs a Get Hired programme to help young people back into work in Manchester. Does the job support scheme allow businesses to recruit new staff or just existing ones? I think we might have had an answer to this, but it's good to get some clarification.
Yeah, so that touches on the point that to be eligible, assuming as an organisation you're eligible as the employer, the individuals that you can claim the grant for have to have been employed, and not only that, but you basically have to have processed them through PAYE, so HMRC is aware of them, on or before the 23rd of September. So unfortunately, if people have been, I mean, in theory, you could have been officially given the job even a couple of days ahead of that deadline, and there will be nothing about you on the RTI PAYE system, which means unfortunately you won't be able to claim for them. So yes, that really gets to that specific eligibility criteria.
Thank you for clarifying that one.
Can I chip in a bit of extra there, which is just the plan for jobs that the government published in July does have some incentives for people taking on young people if they are apprentices or trainees. So it's just worth having a look at those for any financial support that you can have specifically for taking on young people.
Okay, thank you. We'll add that in. Are we okay to move on to the next question? So Caroline was asking around the job retention bonus, saying that I understand that individuals have to be employed at least until the 31st of January 2021, but what if they're going to be made redundant during February and are entitled to a month's notice? Would that mean they would be on notice on the 31st of January and so the bonus would not be payable?
Yes, so again, we've covered that off. So to be eligible, the individual must not have either obviously been dismissed, but they must also not have been served notice of their dismissal, whether that's for redundancy or anything else. So obviously, depending on the notice requirement for the individual, if you're looking to let someone go in February, there's a decent chance you will fall short of that eligibility criteria. So you can't dismiss someone, but you also can't give them notice of termination of their employment on or before the 31st.
Okay, does that answer your question, Caroline? Yes, we've got some nodding. Very good. Thank you very much.
I would just add quickly, as we've mentioned, the oh no, sorry. In my head, I was getting cross wires there with the JSS. Forget it. We've answered the question.
Do not worry. I've got one more question that we will take now, and then if I'm okay to send the rest of the questions that have gone unanswered to you, will you be okay to fill some of the gaps in so that we can finish on time? So another question came through via Anna saying some charity trustees made the decision not to use the furlough scheme because it received public funding and the guidance suggested this was not really allowed. Should trustees now be considering the use of the job support scheme?
I think we don't know because of the guidance not being out yet, but I suspect that it will be similar in that where people are drawing from public funds which are not reduced, then the expectation will be that they don't use the JSS. But also we've had clients who just chose not to use the furlough scheme on a moral basis, that they felt they could fund their employees at the moment from existing sources. And it may be that your charity trustees take a similar decision. It obviously needs to be part of a business plan, but also part of a look at the way the charity works in line with its objectives. But things have moved on, and decisions you made back in April, May are one thing, but you need to look at your long-term survival, and it may be now in the best interest of the charity to take this government support.
Thank you very much for that. Does that answer Anna's question? Yeah, okay. I think she's in the chat box somewhere. Very good. Then I think that was a good amount of the questions. I know we had one or two more that we will definitely get answers to via the resource pack, and I've been collating the questions and the answers in from the chat box there as well. So I'll pass back over to Helen to close the show. But thank you very much for all of your questions, and we will get the answers to you shortly. Thank you.
Yeah, so Danielle's put in the chat box already that we will send on a copy of the slides and the questions and answers by the end of the week. So you should have some more information that we have at the moment. And obviously, as has been repeated regularly throughout, please keep an eye on the new guidance and the new sort of detail that comes out, hopefully in the next week or so, just to kind of answer some of the questions that we couldn't. So it leaves me to thank very much Aliko and Michael from Wrigley's. Thank you so much for that information and for sharing what you have, and for the resources as well that I'm sure will be really useful in terms of reading around the subject at the moment. So thank you also to everyone for coming along, and please keep a lookout for our other webinars. Danielle, do you want to do a quick plug for our webinar on Thursday?
We do have a webinar on Thursday, and it's an update from Manchester City Council around the new social housing register, the review of that. So if you are interested, or if you do have clients that you might be supporting that use Manchester Move on a regular basis to gain social housing, then please come along to that. It's an update and on that review. So what the changes have been after the review process. So please come along if is of interest. It's on Thursday between 1 and 2 p.m. and we can send over Zoom details if you want to join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody, and thank you to our speakers, and hopefully we will see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Is that Abby? Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Say bye.
Bye. Thank you. That's brilliant.
See you soon.
Yeah.
Someone's already getting an MS Teams call.
That's it. Yeah, they're literally from one Zoom to another. Is it you, Helen? Are you busy?
I can't see, there's nothing coming up on my.
I bet it's me. Is it me?
Oh, is it you?
No. Who would be wanting to speak to me? No one.